Welcome all. Today, we'll try to analyze the paper Union Public Service Commission Mains General Studies Paper 2 dealing with polity and governance. Dealing with the first question, the most significant achievement of modern law. Let us be very specific with respect to the question, because the most significant achievement of modern law in India is the constitutionalization of environmental problems by the Supreme Court. So here there are two aspects what the students are expected to write or what the aspirants are expected to write. One is the modern law and judiciary. Second, the constitutionalization. When we talk about constitutionalization, first of all, we have to highlight discuss this statement with the help of relevant case laws. So relevant case laws to deal with the Supreme Court, the Supreme Court pronouncements. So first of all, what are the provisions that the Constitution has incorporated with respect to the environment? We have two specific areas where the Constitution recognizes the environment. One is the directive principles. Specifically under Article 48 and 49, with respect to agriculture and environment, the Constitution is very specific in terms of dealing with environment. And subsequently, because of the growing social agitation, social unrest, the Indira Gandhi government also introduced fundamental duties into the Constitution. So even fundamental duties has a provision dealing with environment. So these are the constitutional, identified provisions wherein the environment needs to be safeguarded, secured, protected, preserved, whatever we talk about. And second important aspect that has happened with respect to the environment is the concern that the global society started expressing towards environment. This is something that happened in the early 70s with the Stockholm Conference. So Stockholm Conference appears to be the precursor for a shift towards environmental politics. So from that context, we ended up in 2015 with respect to the Sustainable Development Goals, where economy and environment have to be combined together. So what is important with respect to the Indian judiciary? Because when we talk about Supreme Court and the case laws in particular, the most important aspect with respect to the Supreme Court and the case law pertain to the people's confidence or people's lack of confidence in the system. So the people did not have the confidence in the existing system, and that is the reason why since early 1970s, people started taking the initiative to preserve their own life resources. And this is how we identify the Chipko movement. Chipko movement is a people's agitation trying to preserve their own life resources, and this is directly linked to the environment. So the beginning is made because of the social unrest. And this social unrest subsequently resulted in Supreme Court's pronunciation in terms of due process law. Supreme Court radically, in fact, enhanced or expanded the scope of Article 21, right to life, because this is a major shift that the Supreme Court has introduced when it has identified that it is not the procedure established by law, but the due process of law. No one's life and personal liberty can be deprived without the due process of law, Article 21. And this is something that has enhanced the power of the judiciary in India. With subsequent judicial pronouncements, what we see is the judiciary taking a proactive role in safeguarding the quality of life. And quality of life also included environmental concerns. So we find Supreme Court repeated intervention, either in terms of the cracking of the crackers during the Diwali, where identifying noise and voice pollution or air pollution to be a detriment with respect to the quality of life. So in the Supreme Court has taken up the concern in terms of preserving the quality of life of the individual, and this is only something that is possible by safeguarding the environment. So the most significant achievement of the modern law in India is the constitutionalization of environmental problems by the Supreme Court. Even though we had the provisions identified under the Constitution under Part 4, both in terms of Part 4 and Part 4A dealing with respect to the fundamental duties, but specifically when we look at, specifically, the impact has only come with respect to the due recognition of the Supreme Court. So not only in terms of protecting the quality of life, where Supreme Court gave due cognizance, but also with respect to other aspects dealing with with this. So in that context, we find even the Green Tribunal which has evolved in order to secure and protect the environmental concerns. So today, environment has been one of the topmost at the agenda of the Supreme Court. Why? Because of quality of life. So it is not just the animal existence, but the human existence. So human existence remains detrimental in terms of securing the environment. Even Niti Aayog, for that matter, is something that is precisely engaged in protecting the environmental concerns. So environment and ecological development where we combine environment and economy together in terms of realizing our developmental aspirations or developmental needs is something that is closely monitored by the Supreme Court, right? So there are multiple case laws, not one single case law in particular. Even Narmada Bachao Andolan, whatever it is, the agitation that have taken place inside Indian society had its repercussions with respect to the intervention of the highest court. Highest court in terms of safeguarding not only the environment, but even the quality of life of the people in India. So when we look at Supreme Court intervention, it is not in the interest of securing the environment alone, but Supreme Court intervention is also identified in terms of specifically safeguarding the quality of life. And this is where the idea of governance has completely shifted. So when we look at governance is something that is shifted from the orbit of the government itself. So it has gone beyond the government to include the civil society. So Supreme Court intervention with respect to the case laws, you can give any multiple case laws because every case law is a significant aspect in terms of protecting the quality of life of the individuals, right? So this you start the answer with the part 4, where a specific recognition is given to the environmental concerns by the Constitution itself, and what Indira Gandhi has done as part of including fundamental duties, which also incorporated provisions with respect to environment. But subsequently, when we move beyond that, the due process clause is particularly important in terms of Supreme Court intervention. So without due process clause, Supreme Court had a limited impact because under procedure established by law, Supreme Court did not had the power to challenge the legislations that are enacted. But post due process, Supreme Court enhanced its own power, and this is where we see the recurring intervention of Supreme Court, particularly with respect to the quality of life, and this is where we identify the concerns expressed. And moving to the second question, this is also directly dealing with respect to the dynamics, because right of movement and residence. Right of movement and residence is something, right of movement, where is my question? Where is my question? Question number 2. Right of movement and residence throughout the territory of India are freely available to the Indian citizens. But these rights are not absolute comment. So here, look at this. Comment means you can express your own opinion. You are not bound to give any academic answer to this, because most of the polity and governance are opinion oriented. Even the first question that I read with respect to the judicial intervention, it is something that is left open to you. But only thing is you have to highlight how judiciary has intervened with respect to securing the quality of life. So due process is one area where judiciary has taken up the concern in terms of preserving the quality of life of the individual. So it is not concerned only with respect to the existence as such, animal existence as such, but human existence. So moving to the second question, right of movement and residence throughout the territory of India are freely available to the Indian citizens. This is something that is guaranteed to all under Article 19. But remember, Article 19 comes with reasonable restrictions. And the reasonable restrictions that are part of the Article 19 deal with social control. So we did have these freedoms. And this is where we differ from the Americans. In the United States of America, the freedoms are more or less absolute. They do not come with any restrictions. Absolute freedom means freedoms which are extended without having any restrictions. But when we look at India, the concept of this freedom has come with restrictions, and these restrictions are identified by the Constitution itself. And specifically, the Constitution laid down certain reasonable restrictions in terms of social control. But when you talk about this reasonableness, the Constitution also identified who has the authority to identify what is reasonable, right? So the authority identified to identify what is reasonable is judiciary, and that is where independent judiciary is identified. So independent judiciary is expressly identified to understand what is reasonable. So restrictions are there. We don't have absolute freedom. So right of movement and residence throughout the territory of India are freely available, but it comes with certain restrictions. Certain restrictions which in fact resulted in differential treatment of the citizens. So even though we have single citizenship, we are not treated equal citizens everywhere. And those areas which are identified as inhospitable terrains or disturbed areas like the northeastern part, where inner line permit protected the aborigines or the indigenous population, or like Article 35A, which protected the Kashmiris from permanent residency, or the inhospitable terrain identified with respect to Himachal Pradesh, Uttarakhand, where outsiders cannot go and buy property. So there are restrictions in place with respect to the residents. They cannot make permanent residence, but they can always identify themselves in terms of temporary residence anywhere in India. So these restrictions are not, these freedoms are not absolute, but they come with reasonable restrictions imposed by the Constitution itself. Because Article 19 is governed by social control. Because these freedoms are there, which are both as part of what J.S. Mill argues, right? J.S. Mill argues your other regarding activities, not only self-regarding activities, but even other regarding activities, because in the exercise of this freedom, you are also in interaction with respect to the outside society. So societal control, and that is the reason why Article 19 freedoms are all governed by three important aspects: public morality, public health, and public security. So they cannot violate them. So you are free to have a residence, or you are free to have movement across India, only as an exception which will not cause any harm with respect to public health, public morality, and public security. So during the pandemic, imposing restrictions was justified because keeping in mind the public health. Similarly, when Article 370 was abrogated, there were certain restrictions imposed. And these restrictions acquired justification because there was a proportionality clause. Because these freedoms are not absolute, they come with restrictions, and these restrictions in fact have resulted in terms of, for the larger public purpose or larger public interest, rights can be trumped. So rights can be trumped keeping in mind the larger public interest, right? So from that point of view, right of movement and residence throughout the territory of India are freely available to the Indian citizens, but these rights are not absolute. They are not absolute because they are governed by reasonable restrictions, keeping in mind the societal larger interest. So societal control occupies a significant position in terms of the enjoyment of the freedoms under Article 19, specifically right of movement and right of residence, right? So right of movement, you are free to move anywhere, provided you are not hampering, or you are not becoming an obstacle in public security, public health, and public morality. So keeping in mind these reasonable restrictions, the Indians are provided with respect to these freedoms. You can also add restrictions imposed like Tadipar. In the recent past, we have seen one of the religious Sikh prevented from entering into the city of Hyderabad for the speech that he has delivered outside Hyderabad. Then he filed a petition in the High Court of Telangana against the police commissioner's order, because police commissioner has prevented his right of movement, and the court has heard him and provided him relief. Right? So right of movement and residence is only justified if there are reasonable grounds. So in the absence of reasonable grounds, no Indian can be prevented in terms of these rights, right? So the disturbed area, in terms of protecting the rights of the indigenous population, inner line permit is identified in states like Manipur. So where inner line permit is in force, people from outside India cannot go and make residence there. And this is what I said when I started the differential citizenship. We are not treated equal citizens across India, keeping in mind the concerns of the indigenous population in different parts of India, even though we acquired single citizenship, right? So there are certain reasonable restrictions which help in terms of preventing the enjoyment of these rights. Third question, to what extent in your opinion, again, this is an opinion-based question. In what extent in your opinion, third question, in what extent in your opinion has the decentralization of power in India changed the governance landscape at the grassroots? So decentralization of power in India changed the governance landscape. So decentralization of administration is different from decentralization of governance. Decentralization of administration has taken place on the recommendations of the Balwantrai Mehta Committee. So where it proposed to institutionalize a Panchayat Raj system in India. But the objective remained in order to promote these people's participation with respect to governance, with respect to administration. But decentralization of power in India changed the governance landscape. So the idea of governance, as we try to understand, has only evolved in the early 1990s. So prior to that, we never had any idea of governance, but we were only limited with the idea of government. So the distinction between government and governance is, from a hierarchy of government, we move to a network-based administration of governance. So when we say network-based administration, that shows that it is not just the government alone, but even the non-state actors can be participant to the idea of governance. So this idea of a network created between the state and non-state actors, remained at the forefront, in terms of transforming the rural landscape. And this is where we find the grassroots democracy. So this constitutional amendment 73rd and 74th specifically are created to identify people's active participation in terms of governance. And that is the reason why it has included these provisions which permitted the establishment of a Gram Sabha as a permanent body. Gram Sabha is a major innovation as far as 73rd constitutional amendment is concerned, because all the adult population in the village are the members of the Gram Sabha, and Gram Sabha is permanent, and it is mandated to meet at least twice a year with not more than 6 months interval, and all the developmental activities that take place within the village has to be approved by the Gram Sabha. So Gram Sabha in fact affected a shift from top down to bottom up. So the decision making has moved away from Delhi and it has reached to the villages. So villages evolved as some sort of a republic under this grassroots democracy. So this has completely transformed the village landscape in India, because governance has reached out to the people, promoting participatory governance rather than decentralized administration. Because without people's active participation, even administrative decentralization will not resolve in terms of realizing people's aspirations. So participatory governance or participation of people in governance is something that is acclaimed as one of the major principles or one of the major aspects in the idea of good governance. So when we talk about good governance, we have 8 identified aspects, and participation of people is one aspect, because it is being recognized the incapacity of the state, because state has limited capacity. The state with its limited capacity cannot make a major impact in the quality of life of the people. So it is better to leave many things to the people to plan. So this grassroots democracy, in fact, has come with the idea of not only providing representation to the people, particularly the marginalized and the women, but also it provided an ample opportunity for the people to plan. A decentralized planning is something that is mooted along with social audit. So the people, the expenditure, public expenditure at the grassroots level is also subjected to social audit. These two have in fact resulted in maintaining transparency within governance. So the idea of governance itself is mooted or grounded in the idea of promoting transparency. So grassroots democracy, the idea of grassroots democracy is a very successful idea in terms of maintaining, but it has its own limitations because the women who are provided with respect to almost 50% representation, they are not actively participating. Instead, they are being replaced by their proxies. This is one of the limitations. Otherwise, in due course of time, probably decentralization of power, if the power reaches out to the people as part of this participatory governance, it may have a lasting impact or a lasting effect in terms of improving the quality of life of the people. Then moving to the fourth question, discuss the role of the Vice President of India as the Chairman of Rajya Sabha. Before we talk about the role of Vice President, before we talk about the role of the Vice President, what is important as far as our discussion is concerned, the Vice President in India is not a byrunner. In America, even though the office of Vice President is influenced on the model of the American presidency, in America, the Vice President is the byrunner. Because the Vice President is the byrunner in America, in the absence of President, he will complete the balance of the period of the President in America. No such provision exists in India. So the Vice President at best can be an acting President for a maximum period of 6 months. So there is no comparison in terms of the office of Vice President with respect to India and America. But the idea that is incorporated remains more or less same. So if the Vice President is the President of the Senate, here the Vice President is the Chairman Rajya Sabha. So that is the reason when we look at the powers identified or the powers and functions identified in the Constitution with respect to the Vice President, the Indian Vice President is first recognized as the Chairman Rajya Sabha. He is ex officio Chairman. Because he is Vice President, he is elected Vice President, he is also the Chairman Rajya Sabha. And in that context, when we look at this question, why this question is being raised, because of the proactive intent that the previous Vice President of India has shown, particularly Mr. Venkaiah Naidu. Because Venkaiah Naidu, he tried to accommodate the interests of all. Particularly, he was instrumental in terms of referring the bills that have come for discussion to the House committees. Because Parliament operates through committees. Committees help in terms of having a proper scrutiny of the bill. In the absence of the parliamentary committees, it becomes a futile exercise on the part of the Parliament to have a thorough discussion with respect to what is being presented. Because most of the members are not even aware with respect to the provisions of the law or with respect to the impact and implicit understanding that is there behind the formulation of a particular bill. So if the bills are referred to parliamentary committees, this is the duty, this is the exclusive prerogative of the chairman of the Rajya Sabha and the speaker of the Lok Sabha, where they have the prerogative to refer a bill for a parliamentary committee. Once the bill is referred to a parliamentary committee, then the parliamentary committee can have extensive consultation with respect to all those who are impacted. Then it in fact helps the parliament to arrive at a particular viewpoint or to incorporate the viewpoint of the affected stakeholders. And this is a very important exercise because no modern democracy operates without committees. Committees are the committee system or legislative committees have become part and parcel of modern democracy. We cannot even imagine or think about the functioning of a parliament without the legislative committees, because legislative committees are playing such an important role. And another aspect with respect to the Vice President of India, Rajya Sabha is essentially a second chamber. It is not as powerful as the American Senate. But in the recent past, we have seen that Rajya Sabha, in fact, applied brakes on the power of Lok Sabha or power of the executive in India, particularly during the first term of Prime Minister Modi. The weak opposition prevented any healthy debate taking place within the parliament. But Rajya Sabha, because the government did not have sufficient majority in Rajya Sabha in fact has operated as a major opposition contribution in terms of promoting a healthy debate within Parliament. But now today, I think the government has a majority in both houses, right? So Vice President, the role of the Vice President comes to the limelight when the government does not have majority or when the government has majority. When the government has the majority, then the Vice President is expected to perform the role of a neutral arbiter because he is not expected to take sides. But when the government does not have the majority, then also his role is important. Then is also his role because the Parliament cannot be stalled in terms of performing its duty. The Parliament's duty or the legislature's duty is to enact laws. So the role of Vice President in India is not as significant as the Vice President of America, but still it comes with its own weightage. Because even though he is not elected, does not belong to any house of Parliament, still he is still the Vice President of India has a casting vote. He is having the casting vote, wherein he can exercise this when there is a time. So when we look at the Vice President, particularly it is significant because Rajya Sabha represents the interests of the states. So if you want to maintain the federal spirit, the interests of the states also have to be safeguarded. So from that point of view, the role of Vice President of India appears to be very critical, and at the same time, it demands creativity on the part of the office of Vice President-elect. Discuss the role of National Commission for Backward Classes in the wake of its transformation from a statutory body to a constitutional body. So when we look at the National Commission for Backward Classes, what is so significant about is the National Commission for Backward Classes is something that has evolved because of the social and educational backwardness. So because the Constitution, when it's at the time of its inception, when Constitution came into force, it only recognized the depressed or backward castes in India. The depressed and backward castes constituted the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes in India. But there are other social and educationally backward who also needed state affirmative action. So from that point of view, the state of Tamil Nadu has taken the initiative in terms of extending certain seats reserved for non-Brahmins into medical education. This is the beginning that has made, which resulted in the Supreme Court subsequently recognizing or the Constitution being amended with respect to provisions under Article 15 Clause 4 and 16 Clause 4 appear to be very significant in terms of recognizing social and educational backwardness in India. So the social and educational backwardness, the Supreme Court argued the states are well within their right to provide for, provided there is a rational criteria. So if the states have a rational criteria or a rational justification for social and educational backwardness, the states are always free to introduce any change. So from that point of view, when we look at the role played by the states in terms of this, that is a very significant. So since 1950s, early 1950s, we find two major commissions constituted in terms of identifying the backward caste in India. One was Kaka Kalekar Commission. Thereafter, in Janata Party government constituted BP Mandal. There was no action initiated with respect to Kaka Kalekar Commission, but BP Mandal Commission was implemented by VP Singh government in 1989. And this is where a new beginning is made. When VP Singh tried to introduce or implement Mandal Commission recommendations, then there was a protest movement across India. The Indian public was divided in terms of pro and anti, pro reservations and pro merit. And from this, we find the Supreme Court intervention in Indira Sahani case. The Supreme Court intervened under Indira Sahani case to recommend for constituting National Backward Class Commission. So National Backward Class Commission has its origin. National Backward Class Commission has its origin with respect to states in terms of recognizing the other than who are part of this depressed class. So the population which is in between the forward class and the backward class are the intermediary class groups. So the Supreme Court recommended under Indira Sahani case to constitute a National Backward Class Commission for identifying the backwardness, social and educational backwardness. So in that context, it proposed list revision, and it also identified creamy layer to exclude those caste groups which are benefited, which are not socially or educationally backward, but to include those caste groups which are socially and educationally backward. This was a necessity because BP Mandal has recommended 75% reservations in India. But Ambedkar was always in favor of reservation being a minority. If only when reservations remain minority, reservations acquire significance. So when we look at from that point of view, Supreme Court also acknowledging the one Ambedkar's point of view, it recommended that the reservations cannot exceed 50%. So reservations have to be less than 50%. So from that point of view, we find the recognition or the necessity to constitute National Commission for Backward Classes as a statutory body. But subsequently, the statutory body has become a constitutional body. So what is the difference between constitutional and statutory body? Constitutional body are fully autonomous because constitutional body have come under the office of the President of India. And whereas statutory bodies are not fully autonomous, but semi-autonomous. Semi-autonomous, even though they have autonomy, but they still can be controlled by the central government. So the distinction is when it was a statutory body, even the state governments had the privilege of identifying the OBCs within their respective states. But when it became a constitutional body, it has taken away this exclusive power of the state governments to identify the other backward caste communities. So it is the president who is empowered to identify who is backward and who is not. So this is some way transgressing onto the powers of the state government. So subsequently, this National Commission for Backward Caste, which has acquired a constitutional status under Article 338B, had to be amended to include the concerns of the state government. So usually, social and educational backwardness is something that is identified by the respective state governments, where they maintain some sort of a list revision, and based on these revisions, the operations takes place. But once it becomes a constitutional body, the power has transferred to the president, because president has to notify which classes fall under this category in each and every state, because Presidential Order 1950 is identified to identify the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes across the states in India. Similarly, the president has acquired, once it becomes a constitutional body, the power to notify which all castes fall under the OBC category in the respective states, right? So this power has to complement the activities of the state. This is what the amendment has done. Otherwise, when it became a constitutional body, the state governments have virtually lost the power to identify the OBCs in India, and the power got shifted to the President of India. But the amendment, in fact, tried to restore the balance between both the union government led by the President of India as well as the state governments, where they have the freedom. They have the freedom to identify the OBC status, right? So statutory is semi-autonomous, whereas constitutional is fully autonomous. Fully autonomous. Moving to the next question. The Gati Shakti Yojana needs meticulous coordination between the government and the private sector to the Gati Shakti Yojana needs a meticulous coordination between the government and the private sector to achieve the goals of connectivity. Connectivity is something that is being dominating the Indian governance since the beginning of this millennium. Since 2000, with the Vajpayee government, in fact, focused in terms of developing a quadrilateral national highways connecting the major metropolis across India. Because without infrastructural development, the economic growth and the resultant employment growth cannot take place. So ever since, the focus has shifted onto the infrastructural development in India. So infrastructure did not develop to the anticipated levels. Still, we have a dearth of infrastructure projects or infrastructure facilities across India. Even the rural villages, even today, they are not well connected with respect to even digital connectivity. So the focus has shifted in terms of extending or expanding the scope of connectivity in India. And Prime Minister Modi, his Make in India project initially, when he has taken up in the first phase, did not go as anticipated, probably because of lack of this infra connectivity. So the second phase, he made an exclusive contribution, particularly in the last year, 2021, when he has come with this flagship program, Gati Shakti Yojana, to expedite the connectivity across India by earmarking specific funds, almost 110,000 crores for infrastructural connectivity across India. And this in terms of identified areas where the government intends to invest along with the private sector, because the government does not have sufficient funds at its disposal to take up these initiatives. Because when we look at this quadrilateral, ever since quadrilateral, what we saw is government partnering with respect to the private sector in the development of the national highway projects. Wherever you go across, we find the toll plazas. This is something that reminds us that we are part of a system. We are part of a system where government is partnering with the private sector under public-private partnership, right? So to overcome its limited augmentation, fundraising capacity, because the government cannot spend indecisively, because the idea of development has vastly changed since 1991. Prior to 1991, every increase in public expenditure was considered as a sign of development, but not in the post-1991. Instead, the capacity building of the individual, capacity building of the system is what is identified as a sign of development. That is the reason why the focus has shifted from economic development to human development. So from that point of view, public-private partnership became a necessity, because it exposed the limitations of the state because of lack of its capacity and also lack of its ability to augment the resources. From that point of view, it started partnering with the non-state actors. This is what we talked about as part of the governance. So it started partnering with the non-state actors. Private sector or corporate is also part of the non-state actors, wherein it wanted to facilitate in terms of expanding the presence of the infrastructure across India. Because when you look at Prime Minister Modi's every initiative, it has come with one specific focused area of attention. One area of attention ever since the Make in India project the flagship program that he launched is supply chain. So he wanted India to integrate with respect to this global supply chain. Global supply chain means where India develops its ability to produce to its own capacity. So in order to produce internally and link it with respect to the supply chain, we need to be very economical in terms of our costing. And India's in the absence of infrastructure, this has become a major impediment. It has become a major impediment in terms of India's ambition to be part of a global supply chain integrated scenario. From that point of view, the Prime Minister exclusively focused trying to overcome the delays in terms of fulfilling or completing these infrastructural projects, because there are too many ministries where there is a necessity to have a concerted action or a coordinated action among 16 ministries. So Gati Shakti Yojana is something that is conclusively devised to promote and or to overcome the hurdles in the way of expanding the presence and capacity of infrastructure across India by targeting and identifying areas particularly which are appearing to be very comprehensive, and also trying to prioritize, sensitize the sectors that are essential in terms of India's global needs. So keeping all those things in mind, the ideas, comprehensive ideas, or the sensitizing the ideas, or the prioritizing the sectors, it focused in terms of promoting some sort of a coordinated action, and earmarked 110,000 crores in terms of identified projects which eventually help India to realize its role in filling the void, particularly the other day also there was an interesting article, Happy Mon Jacob, talking about India's geopolitics and geoeconomics. He said that the government only focused on geopolitics, with ignoring geoeconomics, because India refused to join RCEP. And India is also not interested in joining Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. He said both are very important, because without focusing in terms of your connectivity, your economic connectivity, you cannot establish yourself as a geopolitical power in the present. So keeping that in mind, Gati Shakti Yojana may help India in terms of overcoming the major hurdle, particularly in terms of realizing the flagship policy of Make in India, or what is being identified in terms of Atmanirbhar Bharat, or self-reliant India. So from that point of view, this is a major shift that the government intend to promote in terms of advancing the infrastructure facilities across India, which also included digital connectivity. The Rights of Persons with Disability Act 2016 remains only a legal document without intense sensitization. The Rights of Persons with Disability Act 2016 remains only a legal document without intense sensitization of government functionaries and citizens regarding disability. Comment. Again, comment. So comment means where you can freely express your opinion. So they are not expecting any academic answer in terms of your writing. So rights of persons with disability. Why did, first of all, we recognize these rights? The rights of persons of disability. Because rights of persons of disability means people who are not able to do things on their own. People who need special assistance. People who need special assistance. Because India has ratified the UN Convention on the Disabilities in 2006. And because India is a signatory to that convention, we need to provide recognition to the rights of the persons with disability. So accordingly, the Parliament has legislated a law in terms of recognizing the rights of persons with disability. And this law demands that all public spaces and public offices need to have a mechanism to remain sensitive in terms of the needs of the people with disabilities. And that is the reason why it has mandated all public offices and public spaces to have ramps, so that people, differently abled people, can also easily access these offices, right? So they are only infrastructural or physical changes that are incorporated. But the physical changes in itself does not help in solving the problem, because the major problem with respect to the person with disability is not just physical or infrastructural, but mostly psychological. So the people have to be sensitized. The functionaries have to be sensitized with respect to the needs of these disabled. Only then the governance will be effective. Otherwise, we would only be part of a government disconnected from the people. A government which is disconnected from the people is what? A government which is not participative. That is the reason why when we talked about grassroots democracy, this is the thing that I was trying to highlight. Because even if it does not promote active citizenship, but at the same time, it cannot ignore the concerns of the people who are differently challenged or differently abled. So because keeping this in mind, in the absence of psychological factors, the physical or material factors alone does not help in terms of advancing the interest, because the rights can only be recognized where there is a psychological transformation, where people become sensitive to the needs of these differently challenged, right? So it is not sufficient only to introduce cosmetic changes, but what is needed is structural changes. These structural changes which have to be part of your thinking. Until unless we empathize with them, we cannot in fact address the problems of these of the physically challenged. And that is the reason why it is rightly pointed out, the rights of person with disability only remained a legal document, a legal recognition without any impact. The impact is not there because the people or the functionaries, the bureaucracy is not sensitive, and the people are not sensitive. in recognizing the needs of the disabled. But the act itself is something that is very proactive. Proactive because it in fact helps in terms of recognizing. It helps in terms of recognizing. The only thing is not limiting itself to the physical, but extending to the psychological domain, where people also become sensitive to the needs of the disabled persons or the mentally challenged persons or differently abled persons. Only then the objectives identified behind this legislation enacted by the parliament shall be fulfilled. Reforming the government delivery system through the direct benefit transfer scheme is a progressive step, but it has limitations to comment. Another issue that deals with comment. So reforming the government delivery system through the direct benefit transfer is a progressive step, but it has limitations too. But one thing very important with respect to this question is the impact of technology in terms of governance. Direct benefit transfer scheme is something that extensively relies on technology. So the use of technology as a progressive measure in terms of overcoming the so direct benefit system is something that is mooted to overcome the limitations identified with respect to the capacity of the government, because the government's capacity has failed in terms of promoting or realizing the aspirations, particularly of the targeted poor in India, because of proliferations or because of corruption. Because the second major source of corruption in India after real estate is public distribution system. So in order to overcome the incapacity of the state in preventing the pilferages, the state mooted the idea of using technology. But technology cannot be the only alternate. Technology may help in reaching out to the people better. So direct benefit transfer scheme is a progressive measure adopted in other societies. So for example, take Brazil. In Brazil, the direct benefit transfer scheme succeeded in terms of conditional cash transfer because it helped in terms of technology, helped in terms of realizing the aspirations of the state as well as the needs of the people, because the state has come with an aspiration to promote institutional deliveries so that it can prevent the infant mortality or maternal mortality. That is the objective that the state had, and it succeeded in realizing. But when it comes to the different societies like India, right? So direct benefit transfer scheme may not be such a progressive idea, because by falling back on the technology, because technology may help us in identifying technology may help us in terms of our identity or as a proof of identity like Aadhaar, but technology does not help in terms of identifying poverty. So this poverty is again something that is identified only through the capacity of the state. Until unless we secure the signature of an MRO or someone are competent enough to identify that we remain poor, you don't tend to get your white card. So it is not technology which is helping in terms of identifying your poverty. Technology only helps in the identity of the self, not in the identity of the poverty of the self. And that is one of the major limitations that we have. So this again, we fall back on the capacity of the state. Another limitation when we look at is direct benefit transfer scheme is an idea that helps in terms of transferring money directly into the account of the people. When we transfer money into the account of people, that may not help in terms of realizing the nutritional needs. Because when you give take-home ration, at least this is used in terms of survival. Because this, particularly to the targeted beneficiaries or targeted public distribution system, or the Antyodaya scheme or Antyodaya Yojana, which helped in terms of realizing their hunger, because whatever the public distribution system subsidized, or in some cases, particularly during the pandemic, the food is given free of cost. That helped in terms of their survival. But if we completely shift towards direct benefit transfer scheme, there is a danger of increasing incidence of malnutrition in India. So in the absence of nutritional diet, it may have a far-reaching impact in terms of aggravating the malnutrition in India. So direct benefit transfer scheme is a progressive idea which helps in terms of overcoming corruption, which also directly helps in terms of through the use of technology. It helps in terms of reaching out the benefits to the poorest of the poor in India. But it comes with two limitations. One, the digital connectivity. Not everyone is digitally connected. Until and unless citizens are digitally empowered, we cannot aspire to have a system which relies exclusively on technology. And the second major limitation is the people not being sensitive to the nutritional needs. So this may in fact aggravate the idea of malnutrition in India. And the third, the technology cannot replace capacity of the state. Technology, however good it may be, ultimately it is the capacity of the state which helps in terms of identifying the poverty, right? So these are the limitations that we try to identify with respect to the direct benefit transfer scheme. It is good as long as it helps in terms of overcoming, the immediate necessities of the people, like one nation, one ration. One nation, one ration was a major success during the pandemic because it helped people who lost livelihood to survive, right? And the digitalization helped them, but not in all cases. Not in all cases. So we have to be very conscious in terms of introducing direct benefit transfer scheme as a progressive step, replacing the state intervention, particularly in terms of addressing poverty. Discuss the procedures to decide the disputes arising out of the election of a member of the parliament or a state legislature under the Representation of People's Act. Discuss the procedures to decide the disputes arising out of the election of a member of the parliament or a state legislature under the Representation of People's Act 1951. What are the grounds on which the election of any returned candidate may be declared void? What remedy is available to the aggrieved party against the decision? Refer to the case laws. So the question is a very lengthy, but the answer is very simple. Because Representation of People's Act comes in two provisions. One is Representation of People's Act 1950 dealing with the structure, and Representation of People's Act 1951 dealing with the process. So structure identified the qualifications of a voter, and the process identifies the qualification of an elected representative. Because the qualifications of the elected representative are not uniform, and they are part of the dynamic process because they are not static. They can keep changing from time to time. For example, take the representation of Gram Panchayats. The Gram Panchayat members have come with more qualifications in some of the states in North. For example, in Rajasthan, right, they are prohibited from contesting the election if they do not have minimum qualification, educational qualification like matriculation. They are prohibited from contesting the election if they have more than two-child policy, because family planning is also one of the directives that the state has to focus on. They are prohibited from contesting the election if they don't have an operational toilet, because Swachh Bharat, a flagship program that focuses in terms of promoting Swachhata. So when you look at these qualifications are not uniform across. So they differ from election to election or stage of election to stage of election. So the qualifications at the local bodies are more conditional than the qualifications with respect to the state legislatures and parliament. The members of parliament and state legislatures, in fact, are governed by the Representation of People's Act 1951, wherein the disputes, any electoral disputes or any electoral corruption or any electoral malpractice, it is the Election Commission of India which is vested with the power in terms of disqualification. So Election Commission of India is identified to recommend the disqualification of elected representatives for electoral malpractices. For example, Indira Gandhi's election was declared null and void by the Allahabad High Court based on the recommendation of the Election Commission. Election Commission is identified to recommend to the president or the governor of the state. Based on the recommendation, the action can be initiated for electoral malpractices or for office of profit. Aam Aadmi Party MLAs were recommended to be disqualified by Election Commission under office of profit. So office of profit means where if you are engaged into the government service, for example, the members of assembly are all lawmakers elected. So they cannot assist the executive. They cannot assist the executive because they are exclusively identified as lawmakers. For example, take all the parliamentarians in India. All parliamentarians in India or all state legislative members in India are lawmakers. We have elected them to make the laws. But within these lawmakers, we have a separate unit identified as the executive. So executive is identified specifically because they are administered both separately. And this maintains a distinction between the lawmakers and the executive. So the lawmakers are expected to remain outside the executive. In case if they try to collude with the executive, then it results in conflict of interest. So conflict of interest is also a valid ground for disqualification. Or office of profit. Sonia Gandhi was elected as a chairman, national chairman of a corporation. And when you are drawing money, when you are paid money, because this is where the question comes. So if you are offered money as a salary, other than a salary as an elected representative, then the office of profit attracts. Office of profit attracts when you are drawing salary in two ways. So you are prevented, you are only expected to draw the salary as an elected representative nowhere else. But Aam Aadmi Party members, they wanted the exposure of an executive. So they tried to assist the executive in terms of a learning experience. So Election Commission recommended their disqualification. But the court intervened, the judiciary intervened stating that there is no pecuniary gain. Pecuniary gain means they were not offered any advantage either in terms of salary or in terms of any office exclusively. So in the absence of any expenditure incurred on them by the state directly, so in the absence of any pecuniary gain to them, the judiciary in fact recommended to the restoration of them as members. Even though Election Commission has recommended to disqualify them, and they are members of Delhi Assembly, Aam Aadmi Party. So the president also notified their disqualification, but court intervened. Court intervened and said they cannot be disqualified because in the absence of any pecuniary gain. So office of profit, conflict of interest, electoral malpractices are the grounds under which the Election Commission can recommend the disqualification of an elected representative. Right? So elected representative can also be disqualified in case if he is not a citizen of India. Because the qualifications specify. The qualifications specify is everyone who is not a citizen of India cannot participate. Anyone with insolvency or unsound mind cannot participate. So there are qualifications that are identified. Anyone without the specified age, they stand disqualified. So these are all grounds apart from electoral malpractices as well as the electoral malpractices as well as office of profit and conflict of interest where they stand disqualified. So what remedy is available? So for the disqualified members, the remedy available is if it is an electoral malpractice, or they can file an electoral petition. They can file an electoral petition after the conclusion of the elections, because during the conduct of the Election Commission of India has exclusive power in terms of arbitration. So they are free to move to the court through an electoral petition. Electoral petition if they are members of parliament or if they are members of state legislature, and high courts of the respective states have got original jurisdiction in dealing with respect to the electoral petitions. Whereas with respect to the electoral petitions of president and vice president candidates, the Supreme Court of India has the original jurisdiction. So the remedy is found in terms of high courts, where high courts can deal with respect to these electoral petitions. This is what happened in Indira Gandhi's case. When Allahabad High Court adjudicated Indira Gandhi and declared her to be disqualified for electoral malpractices under Section 123. Section 123 means misusing the official position. Misusing the official position because as the Prime Minister of India, she had the advantage of using Planning Commission and other institutions in terms of her electoral campaign. Her opponent challenged it in the court, stating that Indira Gandhi is misusing her official position because the concept in India identified with respect to the election commission is free, fair and frequent election. Free, fair and frequent election demands that everyone should have an equal opportunity in terms of contesting the elections, and that violated that. And Allahabad High Court acknowledged this and declared Indira Gandhi's election as null and void and disqualified her from contesting the election for next 6 years. And another recent incident that occurred with respect to the disqualification was corruption. Because the disqualification dealing with respect to corruption and criminalization in politics is something with which the Election Commission of India is engaged in. With respect to criminalization of politics, all those who are convicted for more than 3 years in terms of criminal offenses, they stand disqualified for an additional period of 6 years. And to prevent the commercialization, it has introduced the money. So there is a ceiling with respect to the electoral expenditure that each candidate is expected. In case if they exceed that ceiling, and even in case if they don't file their audited affidavit, if they don't submit their audited expenditure statement to the Election Commission, they stand disqualified. So they are all grounds under which an elected member can be disqualified, and the remedy that the elected representative has is in terms of filing an electoral petition with respect to the High Court, because original jurisdiction of the High Court to deal with electoral petitions. And secondly, if they are disqualified under anti-defection, then it is the Speaker of the House. The Speaker of the House who is vested with the power under the 10th schedule, right? So the disqualification can take place either through the recommendation of the Election Commission, or the disqualification can take place through the Speaker. In case if the Speaker is of the opinion that they have defected from one political party to another political party after winning the election. So they are the grounds for disqualification, and the aggrieved party as the only source is in terms of approaching the judiciary. Discuss the essential conditions for exercise of the legislative power by the governor. Discuss the legality of repromulgation of. Discuss the essential conditions for exercise of the legislative power by the governor. Discuss the legality of repromulgation of ordinance by the governor without placing them before the legislature. So when we look at the legislative power of the governor, they are as similar as the legislative power of the president. The governors are identified with exclusive legislative power. The exclusive legislative power, which also includes, because governor is integral to the legislative process. As the president is integral to the parliament, the governor is also integral to the legislative process. Without the consent, without the assent of the governor, no bill is deemed to be passed. So every bill that is passed by the legislature or both houses of legislature, it needs the assent of the governor. And this is what makes governor an essential to the process of legislature or to the process of lawmaking. But the governor is also identified to perform certain other functions with respect to the legislature. Governor has the power to appoint the pro tem speaker. In the recent past, there was a controversy because there is a convention where the pro tem speaker is appointed. The senior most elected representative is nominally appointed as this pro tem speaker, but it is left to the prerogative of the governor. So the prerogative power of the governor is much wider. But when we look at the prerogative power of the governor, it is not only wider, but the governor comes with his own satisfaction. No one can question the satisfaction of the governor. This is what the president also acquired. No one can question the satisfaction of the president. So even if the governor violates the procedures sometimes, the satisfaction of the governor cannot be challenged. And that has actually resulted in governor having played some sort of a role of governor, acquiring some sort of a notoriety. But when we look at the conditions for exercise of the legislative power by the governor, for example, take the recent examples. The Tamil Nadu Assembly, the cabinet has passed a resolution to set free the Rajiv Gandhi assassins. And the governor returned the advice. Neither he returned the advice nor he forwarded. Instead, he said that he wanted to reserve it for the consent of the president. And Supreme Court had to intervene. Supreme Court had to intervene that governor cannot use this discretion in terms of reserving any bill or reserving any executive order, because he is not expected to be the executive head. He is only expected to be a constitutional head. So governor has a restricted legislative power. So from that point of view, he can only send messages. His role is limited. But when it comes to the legality of the promulgation or repromulgation of ordinance, governor has acquired the power under Article 213. Article 213 empowers the governor in the absence of the legislative session. If the session is in force, then the governor does not have the power to promulgate an ordinance. So ordinance making is an extraordinary measure created by the Constitution. And this is partly colonial legacy. This is also partly colonial legacy because 1861 Act created a provision for ordinance making and something that is continued into the post-independent India. And that is the reason why Indian Constitution differs in many categories with respect to the Constitution, particularly of the America. Because in America, the Article 123 specifically identifies the powers of the legislature, the powers of the executive, and the powers of the judiciary. And they remain inseparable. But whereas in the context of India, the Constitution only identified the executive powers. It ignored consciously the legislative and judicial powers, resulting in quasi-legislative and quasi-judicial functioning with respect to in India. And that is where the governor acquired the quasi-legislative power. Even though he is the head of the executive, he also acquired the quasi-legislative power in terms of promulgating an ordinance. And Bihar has the distinction, dubious distinction, of promulgating and repromulgating an ordinance indefinitely for 11 years. Ordinance is an emergency provision created, not an ordinary provision. It's an extraordinary provision. Extraordinary provision identified in case of an emergency when the House is not in session, the executive acquiring the power to enact a law. And this law shall only remain in force for a maximum period of 6 months. Because within 6 months, the House has to meet. According to the constitutional mandate, no House can remain without a meeting for more than 6 months. So any ordinance that is passed has to be approved by the legislature within 6 months. In case if it is not approved by the legislature, the ordinance shall lapse. But without citing the reason, without having any note, covering note for the creation of this ordinance, for the promulgation of the ordinance, the governors are known to have misused this legislative power. And governors are acting on the advice of the government, executive, because governor, when he enacts promulgates an ordinance, he is not doing on his own. He is acting on the advice because governor cannot act without the advice of the cabinet. So he is acting on the advice of the cabinet, and the cabinet, if it recommends promulgation and repromulgation of an ordinance, it's a fraud on the Constitution. Because the Constitution is very specific. It is not an ordinary provision, but an extraordinary provision which has to be used sparingly, only in an emergency. Only in an emergency when their House is not in session, the governor acquires the power. But in case if it is repeatedly misused, then it's a fraud on the Constitution. Right? So the governors, in fact, the role of governor, in fact, has acquired notoriety, not only with respect to their executive performance, but also with respect to their legislative performance, right? So it acquires notoriety both in terms of the reserving the bills or not giving assent or promulgating ordinance. These are the three, 200, 201, 213. I have established a notoriety to the office of governor. While the national political parties in India favor centralization, the regional parties are in favor of state autonomy. The national political parties in India favor centralization. The regional parties are in favor of state autonomy. Comment. This is a classic case question with respect to what is happening in the recent past with respect to center-state relations. Well, the national political parties, because they are the representatives of the union government, they are in favor of enacting centralized policies. So centralization in India originated since Nehru period. Because Nehru tried to dismiss an opposition ruled state government in Kerala as early as 1950s. So ever since we find that the tendencies for centralization in India, and Indira Gandhi consolidated the process of centralization during her era because she was a charismatic leader. She believed in her own ability to make law. So from that point of view, she only maintained a kitchen cabinet to advise her. So it was not the cabinet that was making the decision, but Indira Gandhi herself was making the decision, which resulted in the decline of the institutions in India. So whenever the personality-based politics rise, it also results in the decline of various institutions in India. And that trend continued. But during the coalition era, we find the revival. We moved from personality-based politics to party-based politics because coalition parties, particularly the state government, started influencing the union government or the central government. So from that point of view, from 1989 to almost 2014, it was states which dominated because states always seek autonomy, whereas center always tried to centralize its power. So it was states which gained upper hand. But since 2014, we find a reversal of the trend. We find a reversal of the trend that appeared to be in India prior to or during Nehru and Indira Gandhi. So what we saw is a trend towards centralization of power, particularly with respect to the farm bills. So there are many legislations. There are many legislations which have violated the federal spirit. This is what has been claimed by the states, right? When Indira Gandhi and Nehru expressed this centralizing tendency, we saw the state governments responding through Rajmannar Committee, West Bengal Memorandum, or Anandpur Sahib resolution. No such move is actually come forward from the state governments, except one or two where like TRS talking about the making a wholesale changes.
According to prepatensonline.com,
making whole time changes.
The card may be comprised of at least two sheets.
Making whole time changes with respect to the constitution itself. Because the political parties argue that they lost autonomy. Because most of these centrally sponsored schemes or the flagship policies are thrust upon them. And secondly, the political parties also argue that because of this FRBM Act, Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act, the powers of the state governments or the autonomy of the state government is lost. So there are many tension areas in terms of center-state relations. And this is what, on one side, we see the polarization, particularly national political parties like UPA and NDA, trying to consolidate their gains. On the other side, states trying to regain their autonomy. And that is the reason why 1989 to 2014, we did not find any state demanding autonomy because mostly the union government was controlled by the state. But only since 2014, with the rise of the centralizing power at the union level, we find the idea of reinvention of state autonomy. So state autonomy because particularly the states where the opposition parties have come to power. The states where the opposition parties have come to power like DMK in Tamil Nadu, TRS in Andhra, they are Mamata Banerjee, Trinamool Congress in West Bengal, They are the ones who are opposed to these national parties, particularly the national political party, which is having control over centralized power. And another instance where it is reflected is even with respect to the bureaucracy, because center does not have any appointments. Center falls back on bureaucratic appointments from the states. So states voluntarily, it offers its own personnel on deputation to work in the union government. But in the recent past, the central government, as part of the centralization, tried to modify the rules. This happened with respect to the Chief Secretary of the West Bengal. So the central government gave a dictate to the Chief Secretary of the West Bengal to immediately report at the union government a day before his day of retirement. And he resigned. He resigned and took retirement on the same day. So this is something that was not part of the convention, where the bureaucrats who are willing to, who wanted to voluntarily go and work in the center on deputation, they were sent, but not in terms of having a dictates to work with respect to the union government. So all these, they are not one, but we find hundreds or multiples of tension areas between the center and state because of the party politics. So because the conflict is not directly in terms of institutions, the conflict is in terms of political parties which have come to power differently, right? Like Kejriwal versus the center, because central government is BJP ruled and Kejriwal occupied position or representing Aam Aadmi Party in Delhi. Similarly, so wherever we find these different political parties having come to power, we find the conflicting areas only in terms of political dynamics, not in terms of institutional design as such, right? So while the national political parties, they have tendency to control across India, whether it is a farm bill or any other bill. But whereas the state governments, they wanted to gain back that autonomy which they enjoyed from 1989 to 2014 as part of the coalition era. Critically examine the procedures to which the President of India and France are elected. This is a comparative question. So when we talk about critically examine the procedures through which the Presidents of India and France are elected, this is a comparative question because the procedures identified with the election to the office of President and France are completely different. Because French President is a real executive, whereas Indian President is a nominal executive. So there are vast differences in terms of this. Indian President is elected in terms of procedure through an electoral college, similar to the electoral college in terms of America. So where both President of America and President of India are elected through indirect elections, because we elect our lawmakers in parliament and state legislatures, who in turn elect the President of India. So the election to the office of President of India is not directly based on universal adult franchise, whereas the President of France is elected based on universal adult franchise. So there are vast areas, both in terms of the procedure for election as well as in terms of the functioning of the office of President. Indian President, though he has all the powers identified with him, but he cannot exercise these powers independently. Whereas the French President is directly elected based on universal adult franchise, he can exercise the powers directly, independently. So when you look at the procedures through which the President of India and France are elected, the procedures are different. The procedures are different because French President is directly elected, whereas Indian President is indirectly elected by the electoral college constituting of elected representatives, right? So the method of election is different. The powers that the presidents exercise are different. And the Indian President is identified with all the powers like French President. But only difference is he cannot act independently, whereas French President can. Even though French presidency, French government is not a fully presidential, it is some sort of a semi-government where presidential and parliamentary system combined together, right? So it is the council that identifies the election of the president in France, whereas the electoral college, which helps in identifying the election of president in India. So it is a 250 marks question with respect to these procedures. So this question cannot be restricted only to procedures. So you have to go beyond the procedures, even in identifying the functions, because India and France are not procedural democracy. India and France are not procedural democracy, because India may be procedural democracy because we give due cognizance to procedures over substance. We are a procedural democracy in giving cognizance, recognition to procedures over substance. But French president is not. He is not limited by the procedures. He has the power to go beyond the procedures to even address the substance, whereas Indian president does not have that. So he is restricted and limited, even though the constitution highlighted that without the consent, without informing the president, we cannot introduce most of the bills, like the money bill, into the parliament or state reorganization bill. But they come with no substance, but it is only implying with the procedures or sticking to the procedures. Similarly, when we look at India, the election itself, the election of the president is based on the single transferable vote, proportional representation through single transferable vote, where the votes are transferred. So we may elaborate, because it's a 250 marks, 250 word answer, 15 marks question. You can elaborate with respect to the voting practice, voting method or voting process, procedure that is followed, wherein you talk about how the president of India is elected if there are more number of candidates, because we find only 2 candidates all through. And one of the candidates would definitely secure more than 50%. If the number of candidates are more than 2, then it may result in terms of the single transferable vote, proportional representation, where the elimination takes place. The elimination process takes place, right? So here, to this extent, French and Indian president have similarities. Even in France, those who don't secure a minimum number of votes, they are eliminated. And only the top 2 contenders are left in the race, So until someone secures 50 plus, they are not declared winner. So this is where we find both procedurally, we have certain similarities, proportional representation through single transferable vote. But even within the procedures, the formalities differ. The formalities differ because Indian president is indirectly elected, whereas French president is directly elected. Discuss the role of the Election Commission of India in the light of the evolution of the Model Code of Conduct. So Election Commission of India is something that is identified. Election Commission of India is specifically identified to play the role of protecting the democracy in India. Because all modern constitutional democracies are electoral democracies. All modern liberal democracies are electoral democracies. Because virtually democracies have translated into elections. And every society is electing a set of elites as part of this election process. And that is the reason why contemporary democracy is elitist in nature. It is elitist and pluralist in nature because we only elect elites. And pluralist because we have competing elites to represent. So there is some sort of a circulation of elites that takes place. And every election helps in returning certain governing and non-governing elites. But essentially the power always remains with respect to the elite. But the objective of creating Election Commission of India is not to sustain this elitism. The objectives with which Election Commission of India is created is to maintain free, fair and frequent election. So free election, fair election and frequent election. Free election is necessary to overcome elitism. Fair election, where the Election Commission has to create conditions for fair conditions for everyone to participate in the election process. And the third, frequent election, because frequent election helps in terms of testing the pulse of the people. These are the 3 objectives with which the Election Commission is identified. And as far as free election is concerned, the Election Commission is very specific because anyone with required age can contest to any seat. So right to vote comes with right to contest. So right to vote and right to contest help in terms of free elections and fair elections. This is where the Election Commission has come with the Model Code of Conduct. And Model Code of Conduct is an Indian innovation, unparalleled in the world. Unparalleled in the world because Election Commission comes with the power to identify its own rules. because election commission is not a colonial legacy. In the colonial past, the elections were conducted by the executive itself. But in the post-independent India, we wanted to specifically create a commission, right? UPSC was a colonial legacy, but not election commission. So election commission was identified to frame its own rules in terms of identifying the procedures and conduct. Though it falls back on the Representation of People's Act 1950 and 51, but election commission comes with the freedom or the prerogativeness to identify its own functioning. And as part of that, it evolved in terms of developing its own model code of conduct. And the model code of conduct is specifically identified to promote fair election. Fair election in the sense to prevent criminals and money power and muscle power dominating the election scenario. So fair elections is only possible when we can contain the flow of money and the domination of the muscle power. So model code of conduct, in fact, is a novel innovation on the part of the election commission to make it fair. So as part of it, it reduced the campaigning phase from 21 days to 15 days to prevent the excessive use of money. It started appointing electoral observers to observe the expenditure on the part of each candidate. So all these measures are adopted and as part of the model code of conduct. And it also imposed restrictions with respect to the expenditure as part of the ceiling. So these measures that are adopted, both in terms of preventing the criminals as well as preventing the money power, because every candidate is expected to file an affidavit wherein he has to declare his criminal antecedents. So he has to declare in the affidavit what all criminal cases pending against him, what are his assets, what are his liabilities, both in his name and in his spouse's name, right? So that it is subject to scrutiny. What are his educational qualifications? So all this personal information is placed on the public domain. So model code of conduct helped in terms of transforming the conduct of elections in India, the conduct of the electoral process in India. So without model code of conduct, election commission thought it cannot conduct free elections, right? So free elections, fair elections is a very important outcome. So model code of conduct as part of this, what we saw is even the election commission have the power to only recognize the political parties, but not to de-recognize. This power is not there with the Election Commission of India to de-recognize political parties. But in order to prevent this, the Election Commission, in fact, has recommended even to impose restrictions on the electoral bonds. Electoral bonds, it argued, will not help in terms of Election Commission preventing the money power of money. For example, in the past, all those donations that the political parties received, if it is less than 20,000, they need not express their identity. But electoral bonds, in fact, helps in terms of preventing the identity of the individual who contributed. This, it argued, will only help in terms of promoting more suitcase companies or more shell companies. More shell companies are floating more of money laundering. But somehow, strangely, Supreme Court refused to intervene with respect to the electoral bonds. Even though Election Commission has given its opinion that electoral bonds will play or would undermine the idea of fair elections. So when we talk in terms of the role of Election Commission in India, in the evolution of the model code of conduct, we need to be very specific in terms of free, fair, and frequent elections. Free election is not just sufficient without fair election, and fair election needs model code of conduct. And frequent election in order to test the pulse of the people. The simultaneous election is not a choice that is advanced because model code of conduct sometimes hampers the state from initiating certain policy decisions. So the government has been arguing that model code of conduct is preventing the state or pushing the state into some sort of a policy paralysis. Instead, they wanted to move towards simultaneous election, but Election Commission has not clearly expressed whether it is in favor of that. Because free election, fair election, and frequent election is what the Election Commission of India as an autonomous constitutional body is expected to maintain, right? So model code of conduct is an innovation, Indian innovation, which helps in terms of preventing money power and muscle power in the electoral process. Besides the welfare schemes, India needs deft management of inflation and unemployment to serve the poor and the underprivileged sections of the society discussed. This is a very important question because this is also something that is appearing in the news. We saw a Supreme Court trying to intervene with respect to the freebies. Besides the welfare scheme, how do we identify welfare? When we talk about welfare, welfare is nothing but state intervention. So welfare is something that the state has acknowledged because India, the directive principles recognize India as a welfare state. So as part of the welfare state, Article 41 identifies the state to intervene with respect to old age pensions or public assistance. So welfare is something that is identified in terms of advancing the state intervention for assistance. So India needs deft management of inflation. So welfare schemes are essentially looked in terms of wasteful expenditure on the part of the state, right? Because when you look at the idea of neo-reforms or neoliberal reforms, which are introduced as part of the governance, neoliberal reforms focus in terms of asset generation. They are against consumption-driven subsidies. So the argument is if consumption-driven subsidies are promoted, right, it only results in rise of inflation. So rise of inflation and management of inflation, because targeting inflation is something that has been taken up aggressively by the government. So the RBI is vested with the responsibility to target the inflation on in and around 4% plus or minus 2. So it cannot exceed beyond that. So there is a monetary policy group trying to govern the impact of inflation. Inflation in the nature of mild inflation is always justified because without mild inflation, there is no incentive to produce. And without incentive to produce, you cannot generate employment. So there is a cyclical relationship between inflation and employment generation. But inflation, if it is not mild, but if it is beyond the levels, permissible levels like plus or minus 2%, 4%, then this variation is detrimental. And this inflation is nothing but excess circulation of money. Excessive circulation of money in the economy is what the cause of inflation, because inflation is nothing but increase in purchasing power. When the purchasing power increases, it creates additional demand. This additional demand will push the price up. So inflation is nothing but increase in the price. So to contain inflation, there are measures adopted at the macroeconomic level in terms of targeting inflation, but at the same time, unemployment to serve the poor and the underprivileged sections of the society. So unemployment, India needs deft management of inflation and unemployment to serve the poor and underprivileged sections of the society. So what measures the state can take up? On one side, it is taking up the welfare schemes, but welfare schemes alone does not help because it is giving like fish every day. If you give fish every day, it only makes you dependent. But if you have to make the society independent from the state, because the neoliberal policy had been to minimize the state interference or the rolling back of the state. The state has to withdraw from welfare and it has to partner with other non-state actors in terms of the welfare. And this is only possible when the state withdraws from welfare, means it cannot completely withdraw from the welfare, but progressively it has to withdraw and promote non-state actors. So non-state actors promotion is where the state has to focus in terms of employment creation. So instead of depending on the state has to help in terms of improving the conditions, improving the capacities, improving the capacity of the individual. This is where skill development programs are created. The state is focusing in terms of skill development because state wants to make you market ready. So instead of depending on the state for employment, the state wants every individual to compete in the market and succeed. So in case if you do not have the capacity to compete in the market, state will provide you with the capacity. So state will make you market ready. So welfare, the idea of welfare is not limited to state alone. The idea of welfare has moved from state to the individual. So every individual is expected to acquire the competence to survive. If you don't want to compete in the market, then you are at loss. So the idea of welfare has conveniently shifted from the state to the individual. But it does not mean the state will not continue to hold welfare. The state will definitely. The state on one side, it will provide old age pensions. It will provide the need of public assistance to the underprivileged. But at the same time, it does not want the people to be ever dependent on the state alone. So it wanted to improve the capacities within the individual. So skill development is something that is specifically targeted and identified in terms of improving this capacity, which makes every individual market ready or market competent, so that they can compete in the market and improve their own welfare on their own instead of depending on the state, right? So this is something that is consciously being made on the part of the state in terms of improving the capacities of the individual. This is where the governance is. Do you agree with the view that increasing dependence on donor agencies? Do you agree with the view that increasing dependence on donor agencies for development reduces the importance of community participation in the development process? Justify your answer. This is something that we have been discussing about governance. So governance, the idea of governance is when we look at the beginning, the idea of welfare, we started under Nehru in terms of community development program. Because even though India adopted liberal democracy, Nehru focused in terms of community development, because Indian mindset is more attuned to community orientation rather than individual orientation. So from that point of view, when you look at the changes that are taken place, the focus had been in terms of community development rather than individual development. And community development did not succeed only through bureaucratic intervention. And that is the reason why Balwant Mehta focused in terms of people's participation in administration. So people's participation in administration did not result in the anticipated improvement in the quality of life of the people. So by 1970s, as we try to understand that the growing unrest has actually alienated people from the state. So people started alienated. Alienated means there is a separation between state and people. The interest of the state appeared to be contradictory to the interest of the mass. So people started protecting their own life resources. And from that movement, there is a gradual shift that has taken place. The state is no longer looked with the same positive intent. So the people started focusing on the alternates. And from that alternates, we find the non-state actors assuming a significant role. So the development agencies or donor agencies or official development assistance, whatever comes, they all come with a targeted ideas and targeted resources. So they are not there for improving the collective life. So a donor agency for development reduces the importance of community participation, because the idea is in terms of community identifying its own needs. But the donor agencies come with their own identified goals and objectives. They may not necessarily be compatible. They may not necessarily be compatible with respect to the needs of the community. So community participation in the development process, because this is not something that is identified in terms of development, in terms of static development. So when you look in terms of development as a process, development as a process is not something that is where we talked about. Development as a process is completely different from development as a per capita growth. Development as a per capita growth is something that is there with the hands of the state, where the expenditure state can incur in higher expenditure in the name of economic growth or per capita growth. But development as a process does not limit itself to only this economic growth or per capita growth. Instead, it relies on multiple factors or multiple facets. So as part of this process, we find human development. As part of this process, where human development, we find to overcome the alienation. So there are multiple things where the state or any particular donor agency cannot be limited or restricted. So what is needed is some sort of a network where state and non-state actors together with the community participation. So when you exclude or alienate the community from the development process, it does not yield the expected results. Only when the community is also participant. That is the reason why I said participation is one of the essential aspects of governance, right? Along with transparency, accountability, responsibility, responsiveness, equity, inclusiveness. Participation is one of the identified aspects. Participation means not just individual participation, but participation at the level of the community. Participation at the level of community in the development process is something that is identified essential as part of this governance. So without which we cannot develop. And that is the reason why to promote this participation of the community, we have a classic example in PESA, Panchayat extension to scheduled areas. Because when you look at scheduled areas, as we try to identify, there are areas which remain partially excluded and completely excluded. They are partially and completely excluded from the development process or from the mainstream. They are completely detached from the mainstream. So when they remain completely detached from the mainstream, the effort is how to bring them back, how to bring them gradually into the mainstream, gradually into the process of development. So this is where the PESA, Panchayat extension to scheduled areas, aimed at, not in terms of the 73rd and 75th, but modified where it recognized the community interest, and recognizing the community interest, it wanted to introduce the possible changes. So community participation is not only limited to scheduled areas. This only as an example we can give, but it is also something that is found necessary even with respect to non-scheduled areas. Without communities' active participation, we cannot make sense with respect to the idea of governance, right? So you can justify your answers by writing how important or how significant it is in terms of community participation. But what I found interestingly is this paper is completely different from the previous papers because there are few questions which are very contemporary. Unlike the last couple of years, where 2 years back questions are asked, this paper appears to be very contemporary, particularly with respect to the debates that were taking place in the recent past. But one interesting observation that I also found with respect to this question paper in particular, is the impact, not only with respect to the recent events, but also most of the questions, they elicit your opinions. So they elicit your opinions. So they are too general in nature. Wherever your opinion is sought, the answer could be very general. Thank you.